Today I'll be making baking powder biscuits. I printed off the first recipe online that I could find because the ingredient list is somewhat important, but as you can see I've gotten rid of the instructions because how it's made is much more important than what goes in it. Procedure is critical when we're talking about quick breads. Now the first thing I'd like to talk about is flour. Flour has two structural components. One is starch and the other is protein. Now they both act quite differently chemically when exposed to moisture. When moisture is added to flour, the starch leaches out from the protein. They separate. Now it doesn't actually dissolve because chemically they're both insoluble, both the protein and the starch, but it does leach and separate from the protein, leaving the protein available to agglutinate, meaning make chains, and protein chains basically turn into rubber. So on baking powder and baking soda, which is a chemical reaction, we only get really one shot at the leavening, at the baking powder making carbon dioxide that lifts or leavens the biscuits, which is critical and keeps us from having hockey puck biscuits, or one of the main principles that keeps us from having the flat, hard, compressed biscuits that so many times so many people make that are sometimes even unedible. What we're going to do is I'll add the ingredients, and the first thing we're going to do is add just a little less than 1 teaspoon of salt. The reason I'm using one less than the recipe is because I'm using salted butter, and the recipe itself calls for unsalted butter. And salted butter contains about 1/4 teaspoon per stick of salt. So I'm going to be adding that. And I'm going to be adding 1 tablespoon of sugar, which is on the recipe. Now, many biscuits don't have sugar. I like the recipes with sugar. It gives a little bit extra flavor, but it also gives a little bit of nice color because the sugar actually carbonizes a little bit in the biscuit and gives it a little bit more brown color. It can anyway. I'm going to mix the dry ingredients fairly well. Don't need to get too carried away. I know a lot of recipes say to sift this together. Not a bad idea, but it's one more tool that I don't have to have and need to clean afterwards. Now what I'm going to do is going to incorporate the fat. Now the fat also separates the protein chains, keeps it from glutenating. And so these layers of fat prevent the protein from glutenating. So I'm going to cut in cold butter, as cold as I can get, which keeps the flour and the fat in layers or in little chunks. We're going to make it to where it's a little bit pea-sized. And that's a little bit boring, so just a minute and I'll get the butter and start and then give you a break. I've cut this butter just a little bit to make my life easier, and I'm going to use a pastry blender. See how that butter is cold and cuts up nicely, and I'll be back in just a moment. Okay, hopefully you can see how there's little chunks of butter and flour, and that's separated. It's not mixed real well, but little pieces. Many recipes says pea size, and that's about right. There's no need to get too carried away in that because what we're trying to do is make the layers of fat and flour and fat and flour. Biscuits are not the only pastry that uses that principle. Things like puff pastry, phyllo dough, all work on the same principle, and you know how light and fluffy they can get. Okay, I'm going to add the moisture now, and this is just a little trick because we're trying to not over stir it. The more starch that we leach out, once again, the more protein is available for agglutination to stick together and make those rubbery chains. So by making a well in the center and adding the moisture, whoops, you know what I didn't do is add the baking powder. So let me go back. It's not too late. Let's go ahead and put that in. I got to talking and forgot one of the most important ingredients. It says 1 tablespoon of baking powder. Okay, I'm going to mix that up again real well. Being human is quite interesting sometimes on camera. I'm glad it's not too late. Perhaps I should have followed the recipe a little more closely. Okay, I'm going to add the milk now. This could be buttermilk. Having a little extra acid activates the soda in the baking powder. Now, double-acting baking powder has both baking soda and some other phosphates, like sodium phosphate and aluminum. These actually, the phosphates actually will be activated just by the moisture and start giving off carbon dioxide. And here in just a moment I'll show you how that works on a video. You can see there's no real reaction. Now I'm going to use the baking powder that's got the sulfates and phosphates in it. And you can see the slow reaction as that gets wet, how that's giving off carbon dioxide. You can see around the outside edges. Now I'm trying to not over stir this. You'll see that it's actually in flakes right now, how everything is sticking together. This is probably the most critical portion of the recipe, is to not over stir it. You can see how there's still flakes of flour and liquefied batter. So let's take this and turn it out onto a board and knead it gently, and we'll cut it into biscuits in just a moment. Okay, I'm going to take some flour and put it out on the board. It's not very moist, so I'm not going to have to use very much flour. If this were more moist, then of course I would use more flour and blend that in as I need it. I'm going to turn this out on the board. Okay, I'm going to flour my hands in the top just a little bit, and what I'm trying to do is bring this into one dough ball, but without over stirring. So I'm going to be very careful and actually knead it a few times to bring it together. Different recipes have different methods of explaining this to you. Put it together, turn it 6 times, bring it into a ball without over stirring. I've heard lots of things, and that's exactly what we're trying to do, is bring it into a dough ball without over stirring. So we're going to be very gentle, and you can see how flaky this is right now. We want it to come together though, but without over stirring. Okay, there we have it. You can still see the layers, and we're going to keep that together. Now, I'm going to use a rolling pin, but you can just use your hands, obviously. But I want to make this as square as possible, and I'll explain why in just a minute. From the center out, not this back and forth stuff. And I'm going to roll it out about a 1/2 inch thick. And yes, a few pieces are falling apart. That's okay. Now what I'm going to do is, most people will, and recipes call for a round biscuit. So I'm going to take a biscuit cutter or a glass or open tuna can, something that's round, and cut these in round biscuits. But then what I have is I have leftover pieces that I'm having to knead again to put it into a thing. And every time someone does that, I can look at the pan of biscuits and they've got 5 of them that are looking beautiful, and the 5th one is a little bit lower and a little bit tougher, and the 7th one is hardly edible because you've stirred it over and over and over. In my way of thinking, I don't have a problem with a square biscuit, so I just square it up. and cut it in pieces. I'm going to cut it into 6 pieces. And it's ready for my pan. I can eat a square biscuit just like a round one, especially if they're still tender and light. And I'm going to put these in the pan, and the best thing to do is to allow these to sit for about 10 minutes so that the baking powder has a chance to do all of its work. The next thing that's important about baking soda and baking powder, especially baking soda, is to do it at a relatively high temperature. On this recipe, I believe it says 425 degrees. Okay, I have baked these in a 425 degree oven for 18 minutes. And as you can see how flaky the biscuits are, they're flaking even just before you open them up. These biscuits, if you remember Jerry Cloward, a famous comedian, talks about biscuits fit for eating. Well, these are biscuits fit for eating. You can see how flaky they are even just in small portions as they come off. Now that's a biscuit fit for eating. Thank you for joining us. Good day.